All right, let's open our Bibles this morning to Mark 16, verse 1, as we are nearing the end here of this book. John Mark wrote this as a response to what Peter had taught him. Peter had led him to the Lord and taught him everything that Jesus had said and done during those years of public ministry. And Mark was so moved by Jesus the servant. In fact, he wrote in his gospel here, not so much of what Jesus said as what he did, why he did it. And he tracks the Lord's servant heart, his availability, his passion for the lost, his endless zeal. In fact, towards the end of chapter 10 is Mark's theme verse, where he wrote that the Son of Man did not come to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life as a ransom for many. Well, the past 3 or 4 Sundays now, we've been looking at the cross, 3 weeks at the cross. Then last week, some of the responses to his death, primarily 2 very silent disciples who kind of come out of the shadows now that he has been killed. Joseph of Arimathea, he had a tomb nearby that he wanted to make available to Jesus. And Nicodemus, the fella who had come to Jesus at night, who now comes during the day, bringing 100 pounds of spices to bury him with, way too much, but all trying to make up for lost time. We ended last week with talking about the faithful ladies. Luke tells us that they stayed at the cross until Jesus was taken down. They followed the body to the tomb. They watched where they laid him and how they buried him, and then purposed that they were in their hearts to come back and do a better job than Nicodemus had done when those Sabbath day travel restrictions were lifted. For sure, between verse 47 here in the next chapter, these were horrible days for everyone, right? I mean, they were times of great despair. You couldn't travel by law. The Sabbath rules kind of extended during this whole time. Most of these guys lived in Galilee. They weren't comfortable here, and now Jesus was dead. In fact, those words, "it is finished" at the cross, meant something far different to them than they had to the Lord. For the disciples, it meant that their hopes were finished, and their plans were finished, and that the Lord was finished. He's dead. Back in John 16, Jesus had said to the boys, "I know you're asking yourself what I meant when I said a little while and you'll see me, and a little while and you won't see me, and you wonder about that. Well, look, you're going to weep and you're going to lament while the world is going to rejoice, and you're going to be sorrowful. But I want you to know your sorrow is going to be turned to joy. As a woman in travail, she forgets as soon as she looks into that baby's eyes all the sorrow she went through to birth that baby. That's how you'll be. Your sorrow you will be gone. You'll see me again, and you'll have a joy that no one will be able to take from you." But that wasn't something that entered into their hearts now. It is finished. And that was what it was to them. When Jesus spoke to that couple on the road to Emmaus that we will look at in detail next week. In fact, he spent all afternoon and early evening with them. When the Lord pulled up and hidden himself from them, and they looked so sad, and the Lord said, "What are you so sad for?" And they literally said to Jesus, "Are you the only guy in town who doesn't know what's going on here?" And Jesus said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, Jesus of Nazareth, the man of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word, and we had hoped he would be the guys to save Israel, but he's dead. And this morning, some of the ladies came back from the tomb and said he was gone, and that they had a vision and all of angels." They didn't even mention that the girls said he was alive, which they did. We sent some guys back to check it out, and they were right. The body's gone, but they didn't send any angels. We're going home. We've had it. It is finished. But on resurrection morning, to the words "it is finished" can be added 3 more words. He is risen. It is finished. He is risen. And that's where we begin this morning. In fact, we want to look for the next 3 weeks at the morning, at the afternoon, and at the evening of the resurrection. They're very clearly laid out, if you will, in the scriptures. The resurrection is certainly at the heart of our faith, right? If there's no empty tomb, we're miserable people. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in chapter 15, "If the Lord is not alive, then our preaching is empty and your faith is in vain, and you are of all people most miserable." Can you imagine living your whole life dedicated to something that's not true? Chasing a dream that will never happen, the impossibilities that then run your life. Throughout the scriptures, there is oftentimes much more to be learned looking around than looking at something. It was true at the crucifixion, it's true at the resurrection as well. Watch the responses, the faithful women, Peter, John, the disciples in hiding, the couple on the road to Emmaus, Thomas, the Roman soldiers, the religious leaders who heard what had happened. They will all just have a different response. If you believe in God and you listen to what Jesus said and you conclude that what he did by rising verifies everything he's ever said, you'll be satisfied. But for those who have determined that they won't believe him at all, they're going to die in their sins, because here's the greatest miracle in all of history, and it's central to the teaching of the disciples. The early church wanted everyone to know one thing: Jesus was dead, and now he's alive, and the evidence was in, and lives were being changed, and it requires a response. So we're going to look at the first 11 verses here of chapter 16 this morning, and we'll kind of fill it in with some of the other accounts so we'll get the big picture. We read in verse 1, "Now, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, they brought spices that they might come to anoint him. It was very early in the morning on the first day of the week that they came to the tomb when the sun had risen." Early morning, we read. Luke tells us the same thing. John writes, "While it was still dark." So the ladies, the ones we are so proud of, set out early in the morning to finish the job of properly burying the Lord that they love. And they'd been waiting for 3 days, and now they finally had the opportunity to travel again, and so they would. I think it was the Scottish preacher Alexander MacLaren who wrote in his Bible over this verse, "Sorrow awakens early." I think if you've ever lost someone that you've loved and you wake up in the middle of the night, those might be the worst of times. You're by yourself, you're facing suffering, and it's a terrifying time. And I don't think the girls got much sleep. Their hearts really were to serve the Lord, and so they make an early start to the graveyard. What they didn't know was how great this day was going to turn out. It just looked pretty somber. Before, it was kind of a task that you had to complete. Never mind the pain. This wasn't going to bring Jesus back, but it was going to give a little bit closure in their own hearts. They weren't setting out to look for someone alive. They were looking for a corpse, and a corpse to just prepare. There's no way to tell from the gospel accounts how many ladies went out that first Easter morning. We're given 3 names here. Luke, I think in chapter 24, adds Joanna to the list. And then there's a little comment there that just says, and the women that were with them. So there could have been a lot. There is, however, a clear path to what happened in order of the scenarios, or in order. Because we gather that the ladies all left together first. And if there was any anger at Jesus, or you let us down, you don't see it in their hearts at all. They just have love and devotion, and they're committed to him. John tells us that as they took off on this pre-dawn trip to the cemetery, that Mary Magdalene let the guys behind. She might have started out with the ladies, but she wasn't waiting for them. They were just going way too slow. She was the one that the Lord had cast 7 demons out of. Jesus said of her, because she has loved much, because she's been forgiven much. And so I think maybe more than anyone else, she just, this affected her more than anyone. And so she runs ahead, John tells us, and she shows up at the tomb first. John tells us that she saw the tomb, and she saw the stone that had been rolled away from the sepulcher, and her fears were the worst. The grave robbers have come to take the Lord away. And so she panics, and she runs to where John lives. He had a house in town, we are told, where Peter was staying with him, Mary, Jesus' mother, was. And she said to them, "They've taken the Lord." And like most men, they don't wait for Mary. They both bolt out of the house over to the cemetery. John, in writing his gospel, he's about 100 years old when he writes it. Peter has been dead for decades. And so John is not sad to write that in their rush to the grave that he beat Peter there. Men are men. There'll always be men. You can't stop bragging, and he beat him there. When they arrives there, John tells us that there are reactions from both of them that are described by the word saw. In Greek, 3 different words for saw, meaning very different things. John, before Peter gets there, looked in, took a look around, and he uses the word blepo. Blepo just means to have something that makes an impression on your retina. It doesn't speak about conclusions or what you might have thought afterwards. It just means you saw it. When Peter came running up afterwards, he ran right by John, right into the tomb. And he looked around and he saw, the word is stereo. It means to develop a theory. Peter was confused. He's not here. He should have been here. Where do you think he goes? And nothing really made sense to him. And so he looks and he runs off. And then John kind of steps in and he looks as well. He sees the handkerchief that had been around his head folded in one place, the grave cloths folded in another. And then he also saw. But the word is orao, and the word orao means to see with understanding. And John, it seems, left that morning with the thought that maybe he's alive. Maybe he put all those things together that the Lord had said, but there was enough evidence for him to have a dawning faith that would be strengthened as the day went on. They both run off, and Mary now comes back by herself. Still the women, not there. She's still the first one there. Weeping, seeing no sign of the boys, no sign of the ladies. She finds herself there alone, John tells us, standing outside of the tomb, weeping and looking down, and she sees 2 angels sitting there in white, one at the head and one at the feet where the Lord has been lay, I should say, and one of them says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" To which I think I might have replied, "It's a graveyard." This is what we do here. But she just said, "Look, they've taken away my Lord. Dead as he was, he's still my Lord. I don't know where they've taken him." And that was her only conversation with an angel. When you're looking for Jesus, angels that are glowing are not really good enough. So as she turns around, she runs right into Jesus, but she doesn't know it's Jesus. She figures maybe he's the gardener, which ought to mess up, I think, in your mind, all of those gold embossed pictures of the risen Christ. Put a hat on him and a weed whacker in his hand. That's really what she saw, right? That was more her impression than anything else. And she said, "Sir, if you know where they've taken him, could you just tell me? I'll go get him." Only love can talk foolishly. She's not going to be able to carry a big guy that's dead anywhere. But, undying devotion, unreasonable love, but love just the same. Whenever you find Jesus after the cross making himself known, he is similar enough in appearance that once you know him, you're all right. You can find him. But until you know him, you can't pick him out of a crowd. And I think the reason is fairly obvious. Every one of us comes to know the Lord by his revelation to our hearts, right? In other words, there's only so far that the word can take you before God has to open your eyes. It has to be by revelation. When Peter confessed Jesus there in Caesarea Philippi, Jesus said to him, "Flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, my Father in heaven." And so whenever you find the Lord, now that he is risen amongst his people, there is always this inability to see who he is until he lets himself be known. It happens here. The 2 on the road to Emmaus, when he began to bless the food later in the day, aha, that's him. When he heard Jesus say, "Mary," to Mary, that's him. Later on, there'll be 7 disciples fishing. The Lord's on the banks cooking. No one gets it. And then as he begins to say things like, "Have you caught anything? Maybe you should fish on the right side." Or, aha, that's the Lord. That's exactly what he said before. So there's all this revelation that takes place. And, that is our hope, certainly, that God might reveal himself to you. Well, there in John, I should say, Jesus said to Mary, "Mary." And the tone was such that only he could speak to her that way. And man, she got it. And she dove for his legs and grabbed hold and wouldn't let go. And it was Jesus who said, "Hey, Mary, you can't cling to me like that. I haven't gone to heaven yet. I haven't ascended." But you go tell the disciples now that I'm ascending, and I'm going to ascend to my Father, and now he's your Father, and I'm going to ascend to my God, and now he's your God. Jesus' death did something. He opened the door for us to have a Father in heaven. We can now have the relationship with God that Jesus had because of his sacrifice. But she wanted to hang on to the physical. Paul would write, we used to know the Lord after the flesh. We don't know him like that anymore. And neither do you and I. We know him in a spiritual sense. So she was the first to see Jesus after the cross. She was the first to be given a commission to go tell others. The reward for her faithfulness was this. The other ladies, by the way, would get theirs soon enough if they just ever get here. And as she goes off to tell everyone else, notice you're in Mark, right? Chapter 16, verse 9. I think if you just kind of flip over. It says, and when he arose early in the morning, first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. Well, she went and she told those who had been with him as they were weeping and mourning. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe her. First to see the Lord, first to the tomb, first to run into unbelief. And they just kind of responded as if, Mary's beside herself. Mark tells us here in chapter 16 that, verse 3, that when the ladies, except for Mary now, when they were walking, they were concerned amongst themselves, who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us? And notice it says in verse 2, they arrived when the sun had risen, or maybe it's S-O-N, we'll see. By the way, this is the reason we're here on Sunday morning and not Saturday morning or Thursday morning. Doesn't mean we can't worship during the week, and we should. But the church began to meet on Sunday mornings just because of the resurrection. And it started here and has continued since this day. So people say, why are you going to church on Sunday? Well, Jesus rose on Sunday. So the girls walk, but they're slower and not as emotionally driven, although they are certainly dedicated. And their concern is, well, we saw how big that stone was. In fact, verse 4 says it was very large. Those who have made estimates of how big the stone was because of the channel in which it still can sit today, estimate that it weighed between 1.5 and 2 tons. So this was something that the girls probably wouldn't necessarily have been able to deal with. But again, love doesn't consider reason. It just goes. They loved him, and no matter what, they were going to go and serve him. Well, Matthew picks up the story and tells us in chapter 28 that there had been an earthquake, a great earthquake that morning, because an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven, had rolled back the stone from the door, and sat down upon it. His countenance was like lightning, his clothing as white as snow, and the guards shook for fear of him, and they became like dead men. So we know how the stone got rolled away. The Lord sent an angel, and I like the angel's attitude. He rolled it back and then sat on it like, ta-da, look what I just did. He just hung around, right? Looking good, and he reflected where he'd been. Like Moses, who had to cover his face when he came down from the mountain because it was glowing. He'd been with the Lord. So he was a reflection of where he'd been, with the Lord. And you might ask yourself, what kind of reflection do you get out in the world? Right? What do you look like? When Peter and John stood before the Sanhedrin, they concluded they weren't ignorant men. They weren't very smart guys necessarily, worldly wise. But they also realized that they had been with Jesus. Well, the guards who had been planted there, remember last week, by Pilate at the request of the chief priests and all, it freaked them out. They either fainted or fell into a coma of fear. It was hard to tell who was shaking worse, the ground or the guards. When they woke up, Matthew tells us, they ran off to tell the priests what had happened. I can only imagine how they looked. And they began to tell the story of the resurrection and of the stone being rolled out. Now understand, the stone is not rolled out a way to let Jesus out, because he passed right through walls, but to let the girls in, right? To open up the door for all of us to see. Well, they told the Sanhedrin guys, the religious guys, what had happened. You would have thought that some of them would have repented at this point, but they didn't. They have another emergency meeting, according to chapter 28 of Matthew. And they decided that their worst fears had been realized and that they better pay big dollars now for a story. And so they came up with a story, and they offered these men, these guards, a lot of money, gave them the story, gave them bribe money, and also gave them a guarantee that if they were ever prosecuted for losing, if you will, a body, their failure to protect the tomb, that they would be protected by these men. So these guys took the money. And Matthew writes in chapter 28, verse 15, that until the time of the writing, that was the predominant story still circulating in town. Matthew wrote his book 30 years later, in the early 60 ADs. And even then, the predominant message of the resurrection was that Jesus hadn't been resurrected, but grave robbers had come to take him. Isn't that interesting? That people are so against the resurrection and so slow to believe it. Oh, it was true certainly for the young and the newly experienced, if you will, folks there in the Gospels. But years later, there's still that struggle, and I think I know why. If you type resurrection into the computer, you'll find lots of pages of people who will tell you what really happened. How the Lord wasn't dead, he's just asleep. You know, he was in a stupor and then he walked out. And it's the craziest stuff. But here's the deal. If you believe the resurrection, then you also have to believe the one who rose, which makes you, when he says you're a sinner, you're going, well, but he was dead. Then it doesn't matter. But if he rose, now you're accountable to him. And so you'll find this being pushed away by the world in 100 different ways. But if you read through your Bible, you know, Peter gets up on Pentecost, first sermon, and the central message is the resurrection. And every time Paul opens his mouth to speak, it's the resurrection that he points to. It's the centerpiece of his message, as well as in the epistles as well. It's mentioned well over 100 times in the New Testament as you continue. But if there's no resurrection, well, then our faith, like Paul said, is in vain. So that was going on when the ladies showed up. Now, we're told here in verse 5, they entered into the tomb. They saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. We are told in Luke there were two angels. Mark only mentions one of them, but he's also clothed in white. I want you to notice an important point there in verse 5. He was a young man, because when we get to heaven, I'm going to be a young man. See what the angel picked? He didn't pick an old man's body. He took a young man. That's because they know better. That's what I'm looking forward to. And you old guys, this is what you should underline that and just put your name right there. You're going to be a young man. They were frightened as could be, these ladies. They panicked. In fact, Luke says they fell on their faces in the dirt. They shook within. They were terrified at what they had seen. But as they fell, it is the angel, verse 6, who said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're seeking Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. Come and see the place where they've laid him. And so now you go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee, and there you will see him as he has said to you." And so the angel seeks to, take away some of their fear and their trembling, if you will. And he said, "I know why you're here. You're looking for Jesus. He died. Well, he's alive. Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" is a part that Luke adds in chapter 24. And then they coming looking for a corpse now hear that Jesus is alive. The angel added, Luke tells us, that he said to them, "Remember when he was here with you, he said that he would meet you in Galilee, and then he said that the Son of Man had to be handed into the hands of sinners, and they would crucify him, and he would be risen on the third day." And then Luke writes, and then they remembered what he had said. So for the first time in all this grief, he did say that. I wonder if that's what this means. Well, initially out of fear, verse 8, they went out quickly, they fled from the tomb, they were trembling and amazed, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Now, if you just stop at that and you don't read the rest of the Gospels, you might think they just kept it to themselves. And apparently, at least for a little while, they did. They said to each other, "We're not telling anybody. Nobody's going to believe. This is ridiculous. Let's get out of here." They might have been slow getting there, but they were quick leaving there. Right? They were moving as quickly as they could. We are told, though, in Luke that they then returned from the tomb, And they went to tell the disciples and the rest, and their words to them seemed like idle tales, and they also didn't believe the rest of the women who showed up. So initially, out of fear, they did nothing. They were reminded by the Lord by the angel what the Lord had said. So they head off to tell the group in hiding, which would have meant this was at least the second report that these in hiding had gotten. And if John happened to show up, maybe the third report, and nothing seems to have moved them at all. So as the light starts to dawn on this Sunday, there is word out there that the Lord is alive. Mary has seen him. Now, the other girls, they get the reward of being the second group to see him, and they worship at his feet. And in fact, as they go home, or as they go back to the group, Matthew 28 tells us that the Lord appeared to them. And with great joy, they grabbed his feet. Sound like everyone was grabbing his feet. I don't know. You're not leaving us again. And the Lord said, you can rejoice. And they worshiped him. And he said, don't be afraid. Go tell my brethren I'll meet them in Galilee, and they'll get to see me there. So that same message is sent back now through Mary Magdalene and through the girls from the angel, from the Lord himself. Go and tell them I'll meet them in Galilee. When I read and have read over this story over the years, I've always thought, what would have happened if the girls had slept in? I mean, they were depressed. Nothing was going well. No one would have blamed it. Their Lord is dead. I'm not getting up. I quit. I'm going to lay in bed till I die. They could have just hung it up. They could have said they were tired or depressed, or it was early, or it was cold, or it was dangerous. But they get up. They get up. You should get up in the morning, get your Bible out, spend 15 or 20 minutes with the Lord. Let God speak to you. It's the best meal of the day, the one in the morning. And then you'll get everything that God intends for you to have. Well, by these reports coming back to at least 120 people hiding, we know that from Acts 1, they considered the words from these girls to be idle tales. The Greek word is leros. It's a medical term to describe someone who is babbling without making any sense. To them, the girls sounded like they were out of their minds. Give them some aspirin, lay them down, they're beside themselves. From the couple on the way to Emmaus, we're told that the fellow Cleopas said to Jesus, we sent some guys down there to check it out. Yeah, the body's gone, but they didn't see any angels. The Lord isn't around there. So we just wrote it off. The girls are a little emotional, and they kind of just put them aside and didn't listen at all. We are told in Luke that when Jesus comes to stand before them in the evening, that Jesus actually rebukes that whole group. How didn't you believe me? It isn't like I didn't send you anyone. And by then, Peter had seen the Lord as well. Only Thomas did not show up that first evening. So the morning was spent by the Lord making himself known, at least to Mary, at least to the ladies, probably to Peter as well. We don't have a time stamp on Peter's meeting with Jesus, but we do know it happened before the evening meeting because that's where it was mentioned. So the morning was all about, I'm alive. You can count on me. The afternoon was all about, I want to use you. Now that you know I'm alive, now let me use you. And then the night's all about, let me send you out. Let me give you my spirit. Let me tell you to wait here until you're empowered. Because now the church has to pick up what Jesus says. Luke writes in Acts, in his introduction, second book that he's written, I wanted to tell you about all that Jesus began both to do and teach until he was taken up by the Spirit, and how he then continued the work to the saints. And that's kind of where we're living now, right? God's still doing his work. It's a culture that's pretty much anti-God. We read in Psalm 94, it's been like that a lot. But yet we are given his Spirit to go forth and accomplish his work. So the proof was out there. The women had seen him. The testimonies were being rejected. There was still a lot of uncertainty. But this was a pretty good day. And by the evening, everyone, maybe except for Thomas, had a pretty good grasp on the fact that God indeed had done what he had said. We'll pick up with the story in the afternoon next Sunday morning. Father, we thank you this morning as we sit together for an empty tomb for the resurrection, for your faithfulness to do exactly what you have told us. That, Lord, there's no doubt, and what sets us apart as Christians from every religion in the world is that we serve a God who is alive. He was dead and he rose. He sacrificed himself. He told us before it happened, and then he did what he said. And Lord, as we watch the reaction of those around, those who knew you, those who had to struggle with the truth now of someone coming back from the dead, of his overcoming power, Lord, help us to see that you are a God that we can trust and rely upon and look to and depend upon, that your word is true, that you say it and you mean it. We can live our lives by it and according to it. And so as we sit together this morning, and if you're here and you're far from God, look, he's right there. You call upon him, you can be saved. That's God's promise. There's nothing else that's left to be done. You just have to believe in him. There's an empty tomb. It's still empty. You can go see it. None of these false gods of the world have risen. They've all talked their stuff and dropped dead. Except for our God. He rules. He lives to give life. And if you want to invite him to be your Lord, he'll come live in you. And he'll save you. And he'll wash you from your sins. And he'll be the one that not only have you been looking for, but once you meet, you'll never want to go anywhere else. And one day you'll be with him in glory. Pastors up front, we'd love to pray with you and ask the Lord to fill your heart. Shall we stand?